I always thought that silence was an emptiness, something that had to be filled with words, music, movement, so that it wouldn't be uncomfortable, so that it wouldn't be scary. I was afraid of silence because it made me hear myself, and I wasn't ready. As a child, I was silent a lot, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't know if anyone was listening. And when I did speak, I often heard, "Speak louder, be more active, don't be weird." And I learned to speak. I learned to be normal. But something in me continued to be silent, like a shadow that wouldn't disappear. I filled the silence with everything I could, with work, with conversations, even with thoughts that had no meaning. If only I wouldn't be left alone with myself, because I didn't know what was there in that silence, and I didn't want to find out. But one day I didn't have time to fill it. The day was hard. People are loud. And I just sat down. Without music. Without a phone. Without words. And silence came. Not as an enemy, but as a guest. I didn't chase it away. I listened. And suddenly I heard. Not a voice. Not a thought. But something deeper. Like a memory that doesn't ask for it, but comes. Like pain that doesn't scream, but is there. Like a truth that can't be explained, but is felt. And I understood. Silence speaks. It's just that not everyone knows how to listen. I began to remember the moments when silence was the only truth. When words were unnecessary. When a look said more than a phrase. And I understood. I always heard. I just didn't admit it. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was space. For myself. For pain. For hope. For what doesn't fit into words. And I didn't want to fill it anymore. I wanted to live it. I allowed myself to be afraid. Because silence is not comfort. This is the truth. And the truth is not always comfortable. But it is mine. And I am no longer hiding. I used to think that knowledge comes through words. Through books, lectures, advice. And I listened. Diligently. I absorbed everything that others said. Because I thought, the more I hear, the more I know. But something always remained behind it. Like a shadow that cannot be explained. Like a feeling that has no name. Silence began to teach me when I stopped looking for answers. When I was simply left alone. Without questions. Without expectations. And it did not bring me knowledge in the form of facts. It brought me myself. As a space in which I could be. Without roles. Without explanations. I sat in a room where nothing was happening. And suddenly I realized, I am not learning, I am remembering. Myself. My reactions. My fears. My desires. And silence did not tell me what was right. It simply showed me what was. I remembered how, as a child, silence was my protection. When the world was too loud, too demanding, I would hide in silence. And then it seemed like an escape. And now it was a return. To myself. To the one who doesn't shout, but knows. Silence taught me to listen not only to others, but to myself. Not only to what sounds, but to what is silent. Because it is in silence that the most important often lives. What doesn't want to be explained. What simply is. I began to notice how much I spoke to avoid. To avoid touching the pain. To avoid admitting fear. To avoid being vulnerable. And when I stopped speaking, all this came. Not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Silence did not demand. It allowed. To be. To listen. To feel. And I no longer wanted to fill it. I wanted to live it. As a lesson. As a gift. As a language that did not need to be translated. I allowed myself to be afraid. Because silence is not comfort. It is the truth. And the truth is not always comfortable. But it is mine. And I am no longer hiding. I looked at myself through the eyes of others for a long time. Through their reactions, expectations, assessments. And every time something in me did not coincide with what they wanted, I thought it was a mistake. That I was not like that. That I needed to change. To be simpler. Easier. More understandable. But silence had no expectations. It did not ask to be comfortable. It simply was. And when I stayed with it, it became a mirror. Not one that shows the appearance, but one that shows the essence. And I saw myself, not as an image, but as a presence. I saw how I was silent when I wanted to scream, how I smiled when it hurt, how I agreed when I wanted to say, no. And each such mention was like a crack in the old facade. And through these cracks I finally saw the light. I remembered how I loved being alone as a child. Not because I didn't like people, but because only in silence was I myself. And how they told me, be more social, don't be strange. And I tried. But something in me always pulled me back, to silence, to myself. Silence showed me that I am not weak. I am deep. That I am not strange. I am sensitive. That I am not silent. I am attentive. And these qualities are not shortcomings. This is me. And I don't want to hide them anymore. I started writing. Not for someone. For myself. And every word was like a step towards myself. Not as an ideal, but as something alive. And silence was there. Like an editor who doesn't correct, but allows. I no longer looked for myself in the eyes of others. Because I already saw myself. In silence. In pauses. In what is not said. And it was the purest mirror. I allowed myself to be afraid. Because silence is not comfort. It is the truth. And the truth is not always comfortable. But it is mine. And I am not hiding anymore. I lived for a long time in rooms that weren't mine. In conversations where there was no room for my words. In relationships where my feelings were superfluous. I learned to squeeze in. To be compact. To not get in the way. And over time, I began to think that this was normal. That being myself was a luxury that had to be earned. But silence didn't require merit. It just was. And when I stayed with it, I felt that I didn't have to be less. I didn't have to be comfortable. I didn't have to be the way I should be. I could be as I am. I began to notice that in silence I wasn't afraid of myself. I wasn't afraid of my thoughts, my reactions, my desires, because no one was judging. No one was interrupting. No one was saying, that's weird. And I could finally breathe. I remembered how I had built imaginary worlds as a child, where everything was quiet, where there was no need to explain, where you could just be. And as they told me, this is an escape. And now I see, it was a return. To myself. To the one who does not scream, but lives. Silence became my space. Not like a room, but like a state, in which I am not afraid to be deep, to be gentle, to be silent, to be real. And this is not an escape. It is a choice. I no longer looked for a place in other people's conversations, because I already had mine. In silence, in pauses, in what is not said. And this was the purest place. I allowed myself to be afraid, because silence is not comfort. It is the truth. And the truth is not always comfortable. But it is mine. And I no longer hide. I thought for a long time that speaking meant making a sound, being heard, being loud. And I tried. I formulated thoughts. I chose words. I explained myself. But something always remained outside of it. Like a truth that does not fit into a sentence. Like a pain that does not want to be described. Silence taught me to speak differently. Not through phrases, but through presence. Through a look that does not run away. Through silence that does not scare. Through a touch that is not explained. And I saw, sometimes the most important thing is what we did not say. I began to notice how people are drawn to silence. Not because it is comfortable, but because it is honest. It does not pressure. It does not force. It does not evaluate. It simply is. And in it is permission. To be. To feel. To be silent. I no longer tried to convince. I simply was. And this became my way of speaking. Without slogans. Without arguments. Without shoulds. Just being there. And this is the deepest conversation. I remembered how, as a child, silence was my way of loving. I didn't say, "I love you." I just stayed close. And then it seemed insufficient. And now it became everything. Silence became my language. Not as an escape, but as a choice. Because in it is the truth. In it is depth. In it is me. And when I am silent, I do not disappear. I am present. I allowed myself to be afraid. And not to hide it. Because fear is also a language. And if I want to be real, I have to speak with all my parts. Even the parts that are silent. I learned to speak without words. And this is the purest thing I have ever said.